Kamala Harris's past support for handgun confiscation comes to light, plus the gun control groups dwarf the NRA in political fundraising. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics. And this week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end. Getting into some of the big stories of the week, we have obviously a story that we broke about Kamala Harris and her past support for what can only be described as a handgun confiscation measure, Proposition H in San Francisco. It was a ballot measure that ended up passing, and we uncovered that she was supportive of that.
Yeah, pretty big story, I think. I mean, it goes to a lot of what she's been talking about on the trail recently, and it's a previously, I think, undiscussed or undiscovered part of her record, which is an important thing for people to know and understand when someone is running for president. That's my view of these things, at least. And so this is something we're going to talk in depth to the gun rights lawyer in California who actually fought this proposition and won in the end, and who had a really like 20 years of going back and forth with Kamala Harris during her time in various positions in California, starting at in this case as San Francisco DA. So his name's Chuck Michel. He's the president of the California Rifle and Pistol Association. He remembers her supporting this Proposition H, it was called. And then we also have contemporary reporting from the San Jose Mercury News that describes her as really one of the only supporters. There were only one of the remarkable things about this story is that there were only like 5 people named as officials named as supporters of this proposition, this ban on handguns, which was as you described it, a confiscation ban, because it banned not only the sale and manufacture and purchase of handguns, but also their possession for all San Francisco residents, except active duty law enforcement, active military, and security guards. Those were the only carve-outs they had. But anyone else who was a San Francisco resident would have had to turn in their guns. They would have had 90 days from the enactment of the measure to do that. There wasn't, it didn't have punishments attached to it. The proposition left space for consultation with actually the mayor, but also the district attorney, which was Kamala Harris at the time. But it never got that far because the proposition was challenged and lost in court, in California state court, not federal court. So to give you sort of an idea of what kind of measure this was. It largely was not supported by other prominent gun control activists at the time, including the mayor of San Francisco, who was Gavin Newsom, who's now the governor of California. Somebody people might remember who is actively trying to partially repeal the Second Amendment. People might not remember that because it didn't go anywhere, but that's something that he's proposed. He's obviously an extremely staunch gun control activist, but he did not support this proposition, and neither did Dianne Feinstein, the California senator at the time, who had actually previously instituted her own handgun ban, total ban on handgun ownership in San Francisco when she was mayor. That I guess gets to the point of why a lot of gun control activists didn't support this, which was that previous ban under Feinstein was found to be in conflict with state law, the preemption law that says the state is the one who makes gun laws, by the California State Supreme Court. And so that was still precedent at the time. And that is ultimately why the proposition failed. But yeah, we'll get into a lot more of those details and some of the other fights that Chuck Michel had with Kamala Harris over the years in California. But pretty significant thing for her to have backed at the time. I mean, it's certainly one of the most radical gun positions you could have, especially in 2005, right? This wasn't 1970 where these things were a little more popular and efforts to ban handguns were more common at the time. This was something where this is pre-Heller, right before Heller, right? The Supreme Court case that struck down DC's handgun ban. And really the only other city besides DC that had one was Chicago, whose ban was struck down 2 years after Washington, DC's in the McDonald case. But San Francisco passed one right before those Supreme Court cases happened. And ultimately it failed, but it's something that is, a pretty remarkable measure for her to have supported, especially given what she is now saying as a presidential candidate, which is that she personally owns a gun and would not want to take anyone's firearms.
Yeah, especially her campaign surrogates have clarified. She, to this day, refuses to say what kind of gun she owns, but her campaign spokespeople have said it's a handgun. So there's that angle to this, but it just speaks to this broader sort of context of her track record supporting this confiscatory handgun measure. When she ran for president, obviously the first time in 2019, she supported a confiscatory rifle measure. And now her whole strategy is, well, we don't want to take any guns. She said that over and over and over. We just want sales bans of AR-15s and similar rifles. She hasn't, you tried obviously for this story. Other outlets have tried to get her to maybe speak on explaining this discrepancy in her record. And we haven't really gotten much clarification on that to date. But to your point, that's why this story is important, because there's a whole context of a track record of kind of a consistent through line up until now, when she says, no, we don't support taking guns away from anybody. I own a handgun. We just want sales bans.
Yeah. And look, there's nothing wrong with a politician changing their mind or changing their position necessarily. Certainly her opponent, Donald Trump, has changed his position significantly on guns too. He used to support an assault weapons ban before he got into politics. He wrote a book on that point years ago. He used to attack the NRA. Now, obviously, is one of their closest allies. So, it's not some unique thing to her. But I do think that certainly, as somebody running for president, she ought to explain why she's changed her mind on these things. And then, there's a whole slew of questions that this really opens up, because, she, or at least her campaign has said that she said she owns a gun. Her campaign has said it's a handgun, a pocketable handgun of some kind. And so, and they said that she described it, buying it because she was a career prosecutor and she wanted it for self-protection. Okay. And her campaign has said she bought it years before 2019. So when did she buy it? When did she buy this handgun? Did she have it when she was supporting this total ban on handgun ownership in San Francisco? If so, did she plan to turn in her gun? Did she believe she was going to be exempt from this ban? And if that's the case, why is that appropriate for her to be able to own a handgun and not other residents of San Francisco? If she bought it after that, what made her change her mind about handguns, right? Why did she feel there's other firearms you can own, shotguns, rifles, some ones that don't fall under either the handgun ban she supported or the assault weapons ban that she supported. She could have bought those firearms. Why did she choose a handgun? And what made her change her mind to think maybe it is appropriate for me or other people in my circumstances to own handguns? These are all, I think, very legitimate questions. Presumably she has some answer for this. Maybe it's an answer that's going to be convincing for a lot of people. I don't know, because we don't hear any of that from her. And honestly, I think it's a bit strange, right? Because this is the part of her gun ownership story that is probably the most relatable. I think there's a story, we can skip ahead maybe how we normally do this, but you had a story in the links that talked about her campaign walking back that that quote of her from her fundraiser with Oprah, where she said, if somebody breaks into my house, they're going to get shot. And, everyone laughed and they said, oh, that's just a joke. Or her campaign staff said that, right?
Yeah. Mayor Keisha Bottoms, who's an ally and advisor to the campaign, came out and said, oh, she's just joking. She wasn't serious about that. And to your point, that's kind of a odd choice because that was a relatable thing. And most people, it's one of the least controversial aspects of American gun ownership is defending your home from home invaders. And for that to be something that warrants a walkback is a little strange.
It's very odd because she does have, and we've talked about this before, her story on gun ownership is more relatable than, this is not a new tactic. They're not a new argument from Democrats. You see this from Tim Walz, her running mate, and you see it from President Joe Biden, just to name a very small number of the many Democrats who've used this argument over the years. But, they own a gun. They're not, they just want reasonable restrictions, right? But usually, in the case of Walz and Biden, it's Democrats talking about owning shotguns for hunting. And that's the main context that they focus on their gun ownership. It's all about hunting. Hunting's okay. They like hunting, but you don't need these guns we want to ban for hunting. That's a huge, President Biden at the White House event yesterday where Harris spoke but didn't address this story at all, or any other questions surrounding her gun ownership. Biden was using his typical talking points. They're a bit more garbled, I would say, than normally. He likes to tell these different stories, deer with Kevlar vests. He mocks the Tree of Liberty quote from Thomas Jefferson, or at least people who use that quote. And but one of the things he talks about is the assault weapon ban when he first supported that, when he first proposed it. And he supposedly has this whole story about meeting a guy who was fishing in Delaware, and the guy was angry at him over the ban and said he wanted those guns for hunting, and Biden chastised him for not being a good shot because you don't need an AR-15 for hunting. The deer aren't wearing Kevlar vests, blah, blah, blah. This is a common thing. He holds up hunting as the primary reason for gun ownership. Obviously a huge dichotomy between how Democrats talk about that and gun rights activists. But and also, frankly, your average American who owns guns, because most Americans own handguns and most Americans own them for self-defense. Most American gun owners have handguns and they have them for self-defense. And this is in line with what Harris's story is. And you would think she could do a better job of making that a relatable thing if she's going to be talking about this the way she has. But for whatever reason, they've chosen to just, and this comes across in a lot of the ways she speaks on the trail, right? They've chosen to just have a couple of canned lines that she repeats on a lot of issues. And this has been a big pain point for the campaign. It's gotten a lot of criticism overall, the way that they've handled media and interviews and how she speaks in public. And so there's all these questions that are left unanswered and just ignored, really. Right. And it seems to be a purposeful tactic on their part. I guess they seem to believe that if you don't address these stories or these questions, maybe they're better off because fewer people will hear about it than if they said something. I don't know. And they seem to have changed tactics on that a little bit, because at the very beginning of her taking over the top of the ticket, they did put out at least anonymously or through staff, that she didn't support certain positions anymore, including the mandatory buyback of assault weapons. So I don't know why they've stopped even doing that, but they've taken this route of just, maybe they think it's so late in the game that they can just kind of ride it out without having to address anything or be worse. I don't know. It's something. But
there's risks to that. Like you wrote in your members piece this week for this story in particular, this has the potential to have some legs in terms of the campaign, just because of what Proposition H was and how unpopular handgun bans are. You talked about how it could potentially in a race where gun politics haven't made much of a difference, this could be the one angle where it very well could.
Yeah, we talked about this, right? Guns have not been a major issue for voters so far in this election, and we've talked about the reasons why. The lack of high profile gun violence over the past year, the relative lack of it, right, compared to most years. You haven't had a lot of mass shootings, and so you haven't had a lot of coverage of this issue. But we've speculated, like, there's things that could change that. Usually, we were mainly thinking of like a high profile incident of gun violence that really gets a lot of attention on the issue. But this is another one that could change that, even if it doesn't end up, leading news cycles for days and days or whatever. It's something that if you get in front of the right kind of voters, could affect what they do, whether it's gun owners who are supportive of Harris for reasons outside of gun policy, but just need that little bit of reassurance. These are the people that Harris seems to be targeting with her comments about being a gun owner and not wanting to take anyone's guns, right? Somebody who cares about this issue, but it isn't their top issue, and they would vote for Harris, but they want some reassurance on that she's not going to come and try and take their guns away, right? So that kind of voter could be affected by this news. And then, same thing for the other direction, like somebody who doesn't want to vote for Donald Trump for any number of reasons. Whatever, January 6th, there's a lot of things. You could look at Donald Trump and say, I don't want to support this guy, but who cares about gun policy and it says, wow, that's so extreme that I may feel like I have to vote for him. But these are the kind of voters you're talking about. And that might not be a very large percentage of the overall voting population. But in a race where literally tens of thousands of votes could change the outcome, like we saw in the last election, or even in the last two elections, that's what could matter. And the question, I think, at that point becomes, her tactic is ignore this, hope it kind of doesn't make a big splash. I guess they don't want to give fuel to it. Although I think ignoring it does provide fuel to these things. Like, it just gives people reasons to keep asking about it if they haven't said anything. And so, but the other side is like, can the Trump campaign, is the Trump campaign even interested in doing anything with this? Because certainly they all promoted it the other day. I saw a lot of Trump officials were tweeting the story or what have you. But obviously Trump's approach to this point has mostly, his personal discussion of guns is mostly focused on the idea that gun owners don't vote, and he hasn't really tried to go out and give them good reasons to do it. But he has been talking about her wanting to take people's guns away. So this is in line with that. But I don't know, how much emphasis is he going to put on it? We'll see. And then the NRA, I'm sure they would want to have this. It reminds me a lot of 2016. I broke a similar story at the time about Hillary Clinton. She had a fundraiser where she had said that the Supreme Court was wrong on the Second Amendment. She was talking about the Heller decision, right? And she, that was a story that had significant impact in that election because Hillary lost, right, in a super close race in places like Pennsylvania and Arizona that are more pro-gun than the national average, I would say. And, one of the big reasons that had an impact is the NRA put a ton of money into running ads around that audio. Now, that was an audio clip of her saying it. So it was her in her own voice saying this stuff. This is a little bit harder to make into an ad, I would say, because it's just news about her supporting something. We don't have video of it. Nothing has surfaced on that front yet, at least. And so it may be a bit of a harder lift anyway. But the real problem, and this will transition us, I think, into our next story, because, you read about this week, is that the NRA doesn't have any money to spend. We've obviously, this is not news if you've been following the show. The NRA has been struggling, but I think their struggles have gotten even worse, it seems like. So are they going to even have any real resources to put into getting this story in front of the voters they want to reach? What did you find when you looked at the FEC records this week?
Yeah, no, it's a real question because, like you said, we've covered this pretty much every single month this year, just trying to keep tabs on what the gun groups are doing and how they're faring with fundraising. And there's been a disparity almost every single month. I think there was one month where the NRA outraised the gun control groups, but other than that, it's typically trailed. But this month, the gap was massive. It's the first time we've seen a multi-million-dollar gap between the big three gun control groups and the NRA and its gun rights allies. When we're speaking about the gun rights allies, they're usually a pretty small sliver of this. So it's typically just the NRA and its Political Victory Fund, which is its primary PAC that's been very active in past presidential races. This month, it only brought in about $376,000. That's down about $60,000 from last month. And last month was down about $80,000 from the previous month. So it's back-to-back declining fundraising hauls as we're getting closer to the election. Meanwhile, the big three gun control groups brought in about $6 million. So quite a disparity between $6 million and $376,000. And if you add all the other gun rights groups, it's about $420,000. So it doesn't, it's not much of a help. To see
that's not even, that doesn't even match what Giffords alone raised.
Right. Yeah. Giffords alone raised just under $800,000 by itself.
And those NRA numbers are way down from 2016, the year I'm talking about with the Hillary ad, right? Like they were topping millions of dollars a month.
Yeah. August 2016, they brought in 1.5 million. August 2022, they brought in 1.7 million. So you're talking millions of dollars per month in previous election cycles where they're not even getting close to that now.
Yeah, it's ugly. And part of it is the Political Victory Fund can only raise money from NRA members. And there are far fewer NRA members than there used to be, as we've covered extensively here. And the NRA is still locked in their corruption litigation. The settlement was really, it seemed when the judge made his ruling that denied the AG's request for a government monitor of the NRA that everything was going to be wrapped up, maybe several weeks back at least, and it still hasn't wrapped up. They're still negotiating on the terms of the final agreement. And I bet that's still probably hindering their fundraising efforts to a significant degree. One of that month you mentioned where they had outraised the gun control groups, that was the month where the reformers won a bunch of seats in the NRA leadership. I don't know if that's directly connected or not, but it is an interesting data point. Regardless, they're just getting swamped. And now, to be fair, right, there was something that tipped the balances significantly here, right? There's one big donation.
Yeah. So Everytown this year stood up a new PAC. The Demand a Seat PAC is what it's called. I covered it briefly, and I did a members piece a couple weeks back, just kind of tracking where the gun groups are spending their money. And that one popped up. It's a quarterly reporting PAC, so we don't have up-to-date numbers, but the most recent filing from their July filing of that PAC shows that they have about $7.5 million cash on hand, or at the time. And $7 million of that came from a single donation from Michael Bloomberg, who, of course, founded Everytown, and no surprise, he's their biggest
of the gun
primary
funder.
So one of the biggest drivers of Everytown's monthly fundraising haul was a $5 million transfer from that PAC to its super PAC, which is the Victory Fund is what's most traditionally been active in these races. So a huge contribution just from that, Bloomberg infusion. Without that, I think they raised about $170,000. So not a huge sum on its own.
So it's important to understand how these groups operate. Like the reason that Bloomberg, or the reason that Everytown and the gun control groups have outraised the NRA so much this month is because they got a massive cash infusion from one well-off donor, Michael Bloomberg, who has really kind of been the person who put together the modern gun control movement, the gun control movement of the last 10 to 15 years, and has really funded it primarily through his own giving. And also, frankly, the other groups rely significantly on these mega wealthy donors. Steve Ballmer and his wife are another big dollar donors that give a lot to the gun control organizations. certainly the NRA has, and the gun rights groups have wealthy donors as well. But if you look through their fundraising, it's not nearly the same. They are really driven, especially on the PAC side, much more so by the your average small dollar donors.
Yeah, it is an important distinction to make, because I did kind of go through the itemized receipts just to see who was giving when I was pulling these numbers, and it's very much small dollar grassroots on the gun rights side, particularly the NRA PAC side, and it's a lot of Michael Bloomberg obviously is the giant one, but there's a lot of big foundations, big rich executives, that sort of a thing. So it's much more top down versus bottom up when it comes to the funds for these movements.
And it's been that way for forever. So, it is something to understand about the dynamics here. But, there's far fewer small dollar donors to the NRA now. That's reality. Right. And also, one of the other interesting things about those numbers is that Everytown is actually following through. Bloomberg is actually following through on the money that is going to be donated and spent this year, right? Because we reported a while back that Everytown and also Giffords say that they're going to spend tens of millions in this election, which is interesting. Which is we've been watching for that, because Everytown said they were going to spend $50 million in 2020 and then just didn't do it. So you never really know. Now that they said that before the pandemic hit, so there's perhaps a reason they didn't end up spending that much. But this year, I would bank on them actually getting to the numbers that they said they will. Now, some of this spending is going to be not stuff we can track, in a close to real time way, because these FEC numbers are only for certain groups, super PACs and PACs. And so spending through the 501c4s, which is also the political arms of these groups, but they're limited in what they can do. There's different rules for different groups, and there's different rules on reporting your fundraising at different times. So we're not going to see in real time all of the spending that these groups do. We're just going to see the bulk of like their ad buys or their donations to candidates, things like that. But this is a sign that Everytown really is going to try and get to that number they said they would.
Yeah, no, it certainly looks that way. We haven't seen, obviously, they pledged $45 million. We haven't seen that reflected in the numbers just yet, but we have seen them. They just announced a disbursement of $7.5 million. And another thing that makes it is an important caveat, it makes it tricky to track, is the things they say they're spending it on are tough to follow. When someone makes an ad buy, you can kind of track that. But they're talking about funding grassroots volunteer training and candidate support and all these activities that are sort of nebulous and hard to detail in a report. But they have announced $7.5 million spending in that effort. And once again, it comes from this new demand a seat PAC effort. So we'll see when they file their latest reports what that really looks like. But you are seeing that disparity in spending, not just fundraising, actual spending priorities that between the gun rights and gun control groups.
Yeah, and it's getting worse, right? Like you said, the NRA is raising less money at a time that they should be raising more money, and there's not anyone picking up that slack. Certainly not to the level that the NRA is losing steam. And on the flip side, the gun control groups are doing much better, and they seem to be on pace to meet their goals and expectations. So, so things like this Proposition H story are going to be harder for the gun rights groups to get out there. And if the gun control groups want to try and counter this story with their own messaging or whatever, they're going to have an easier time of doing that because they have money to do it.
Yeah, no, it's important. But it's certainly something we're going to keep tabs on as we even closer to the election. You'd expect to see maybe something ramp up, but they just, like you said, we may not have the capacity to do so.
The NRA Super PAC is still pretty dormant, right? Yeah,
that's a great point. The Super PAC for the last 5 months in a row has only raised $400, and it's not really spending anything. Just for context, in August 2020, the Super PAC, the NRA Victory Fund, raised like $4.5 million. So that's quite the difference.
to be clear, like it's similar to what happened with Everytown, where you take money from one group and donate it wholesale to another. Like Super PAC, the NRA has not traditionally tried to raise money for the Super PAC through small dollar donations. What it'll do is it'll raise money through its 501c4, the Institute for Legislative Action, or through PBF. They both donate to the Super PAC. They'll transfer those funds to the Super PAC because the Super PAC is more has a bit more freedom in what it can spend money on, how it can advertise and things. It can basically spend unlimited amounts of money as long as it doesn't coordinate with political campaigns. So it gives groups more, and all these organizations use those kind of groups. But so just to be clear on like that, it hasn't raised a lot of money just means that the NRA hasn't activated it yet, or maybe doesn't have the funds around to put into it. I don't know what's going on there, but it's September. I mean, these are numbers from last month. So maybe they've started now, but yeah, I mean, you see Everytown is activating their Super PAC. That's why they put $5 million in there. NRA is not doing anything with it. It's kind of weird.
Right. No. Yeah. It is not what you'd expect. Yeah. Less than 2 months out.
Somebody from the NRA on the show to talk about the election strategy and what their thought is, but because I think it's important, or anyone from Everytown, any of these groups, I'd love to have them on the show just to dig through how they're viewing the election and where they're putting their money. Although they tend to be tight-lipped about that kind of thing. Yeah. I would be surprised if anyone agreed, but I'd love to do that. Although we do have a little bit of where they're spending because we have Facebook ads. Facebook gives you and you had a little bit on that too. Just super quick before we move on to the next story. Like they're basically spending most of their Facebook ad money, at least on one race, right?
Yeah. So it's mostly the Montana Senate race. Seems to be that they announced a huge $2 million TV ad buy, which is their biggest expenditure of the race so far. And we talked about why that's a very pivotal race for control of the U.S. Senate, where John Tester is a vulnerable Democrat. And if they flip that seat, it's pretty much guaranteed 51 Republican majority in the Senate. So dumping a bunch of money there. They're spending Facebook ads to boost Tim Sheehy. But they've stopped their Facebook ad spending. In another kind of would have been an important race for Republicans that I think is kind of lost now.
They should have never been spending money in this race in the first place, honestly. Right. That was something at the board meeting that I was surprised when they announced, here's our new ad in this race. Tell them what the race is.
Yes, the North Carolina gubernatorial race, where Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson is trying to best Josh Stein, the current attorney general, to replace Roy Cooper, who's term limited. And if anyone's been following the news over the last week or so, they probably know that Robinson got caught saying awful things online.
Yes. Very awful is
more awful things than he's already said publicly. And he's pretty much dead in the water.
Of course, that alludes to why it was weird when obviously I was focused on other things at the board meeting, but this is why it was weird to me that they were announcing new ads in this North Carolina gubernatorial race, because yes, there has been a huge bombshell story about some of the horrible things Mark Robinson seemingly posted online. I think it's pretty clear it was him doing it, given all the reporting that connects him to it. But CNN reported that a huge story, the Black Nazi comments, he wants to bring back slavery, all kinds of graphic. I mean, it's a pornography forum, so you can use your imagination or Google it yourself if you want to find out what he was saying. But before that story came out, this was not a close race anyway.
No, yeah.
He was down in most polling by double digits. The only reason for the NRA to ever spend any money there, and they spent, at least in Facebook ads, which is maybe an indication that they were also spending in other places. In Facebook ads, they spent thousands and thousands of dollars in this race, this complete long shot race, when they don't have any resources. And the only reason to do that is because Mark Robinson is on their board and really rose to fame because of the NRA. He went viral at a town hall meeting that he gave a rant about guns too. And then he was able to get connection with the NRA and then into Republican politics in North Carolina. I mean, he is the lieutenant governor, so he had significant amount of success doing that. But, here's a clue. If somebody goes viral for a rant they gave at a town meeting, they've probably said a lot of wacky things over the years. That's just my general assumption, based on the kind of people who show up to town meetings and give rants. But either way, it was, regardless of all that, I don't know why they were spending money in this race to begin with. He never had a chance of winning. There were no indicators that he had that this was some race they could make a headway into. The only reason to do it is because he's an NRA board member, which is not a good reason to spend the limited resources the group has. But anyway, what's next?
They've cut it off now. Yeah.
Yes, they have stopped now. They haven't. That's the thing. I asked them if they, for explanation of this, right? Why they were spending this money in the first place? Why they've stopped these campaigns? If they still stand by Robinson, who again described himself as a black Nazi on a porn forum, but they didn't respond. And their position as far as endorsing him hasn't changed. He's still on the board as far as I know. So that's where the NRA is at on that. Yeah.
Getting into some of the newsletter links. We mentioned one earlier, but we also have this new piece from Jeff Asher talking about some updated data about crime. We've talked about, he's covered this pretty extensively, just the trends indicating a substantial drop in murder. And we now have the new FBI annual crime data showing that, in fact, murder did decline rapidly in 2023. It was about 11.6% decline.
Fastest rate ever, I think, on record.
Yep. So we actually have data confirmation now. He was early in pointing out that trends were suggesting that, and now we have confirmation.
Yeah, we had him on the show to talk about that a while back. And because, he follows it in real time with reporting from most of the major police departments, because a lot of them report their data publicly on a more frequent basis than what the FBI does. So he could see these trends, and he's an expert and he follows them closely. He's a smart guy. I'd like to have him back on actually to talk more in depth about this, because some of this, there's criticisms out there about FBI's collection. Some of the stuff we talked about years ago, which I believe, as Jeff has said in our most recent podcast, the FBI actually has fixed a lot of the issues with the reporting. There were problems when they first switched over to the new system, where you didn't have data from from a representative sample of police organizations, but they've since changed the process so that they collect more. Basically, they've allowed some police departments to use the old reporting system to continue to use it, just so they can get the data. And so I would say my understanding is that the numbers are actually pretty reliable, at least as reliable as pre-2020 numbers were. So, but I'd like to have him on the show just to go over that more, get full understanding of it, and maybe talk to him about some of the critiques that have been raised in recent weeks around crime reporting. Obviously we focus much more on the murder side of it than some of the other crime stuff, and maybe there's more difficulty in quantifying some of that stuff. I don't know. I'd love to have him. I think we'd try to have him on the show again to get into the details of that.
Yeah, but, I think that'd be great, because I think there was some nuance in the different types of crime. Murder is obviously the top line, that was what declined the most, but there was some nuance and some fluctuations in some of the other categories of crime.
Murder is a bit easier to track because it's something that is less likely to go unreported, for one. Right. Generally, if a dead person shows up and there isn't a good explanation for how they died, it's not going to go unnoticed, that they were murdered. So, other stuff may be a bit harder to track, and we can maybe talk to Jeff about that. But of course, it's, I think it's important to how do the ways that we track it today match to the ways we tracked it 3 or 4 years ago? Are they different? That kind of stuff. It's been interesting to get into it with him, but he wasn't able to join this week. He's a busy guy traveling around, so maybe next week we'll see. But yeah, it's good news, right? Whatever your politics are, however you view it, stories working out in the political space, which everyone's focused on right now because of the election, just regardless, this is good news for the country. I think it's more interesting to me, like why has the murder rate gone way back down so quickly? I mean, we were at a pretty low rate before the pandemic and the rioting that occurred in 2020. And then we had a huge spike around that time. And now we've had a huge pullback to where things were, or maybe even lower than where they were pre-pandemic. So it's kind of a fascinating, unusual situation. I mean, the pandemic was a unusual situation generally. So we got a lot of weird things that came out of it. And this is certainly one of them that I don't know we have a full explanation for quite yet.
Right.
And I'm open to
either way,
all the different explanations that people might have. Yeah.
I say either way, like you said, less murder is always good, regardless of your politics. So
I hope we can all agree on that.
Hopefully.
Certainly we can argue over the reporting numbers and whether they're good or bad, like the techniques and issues or whatever. But I think, less murder is good. Generally speaking, I don't care about the letter next to your name or whatever. So, I think do we have anything else? I think that was everything.
Yeah, there's one last Wall Street Journal story that was kind of interesting about the rise of liberal or self-reported liberal gun owners. Zusha Ellenson and Cam McWhorter, who kind of cover their gun stories over at the Wall Street Journal, did an interesting write-up talking to various, they identified some polling data showing a slight uptick in self-reported liberal gun ownership. And then they talked to actually got some liberal gun owners on the record to talk about their experience, what's driven them to gun ownership, and some of the cultural discomfort there is being in that particular milieu and being a gun owner and not being sure if you should tell your friends.
This is a funny thing because that's such a common point of discussion with even just non-conservative gun owners, especially your more traditional liberal Democrat gun owners. Leftist gun owners are usually pretty comfortable with leftists are much more comfortable with guns than liberals, if that makes any sense. In the American context. They just are a lot more open to owning firearms and than your typical liberal Democrat is. And it's funny because I've spoken to the Liberal Gun Club, which has grown significantly over the last several years as another indicator of this trend. We've talked about this a lot around the pandemic. That was one of the things that was a big takeaway, was that these demographics of people who hadn't traditionally owned firearms were buying them at a higher pace than everyone else during the pandemic, these first-time gun owners. And we've talked about the potential political impact of that down the line, at least. And I don't know if we've seen it or not. Maybe the Harris transformation, you could argue, is perhaps part of that. Now she's running in a general election, so she's kind of just trying to appeal to, but that like we always said, she's trying to appeal with those comments, I think, to people who aren't necessarily voting on gun policy, but who are gun owners that might want to vote for her for lots of other reasons, right? But are concerned about some of these positions she's taken in the past, like the handgun confiscation bill in San Francisco or the mandatory buyback of assault weapons. So if there are more people like that, maybe that's why she feels the need to go out there and approach the issue that way. But it is funny because when I was doing research for the Proposition H story, I was just looking around at some of the news reporting from the time, and one of the groups that opposed Proposition H were the Pink Pistols. And the Pink Pistols are a gay gun rights group that's been around for quite a long time, as you could tell. This is 2005 we're talking about. And that article has the same line, which is also the same line that I've heard many times from people in the Liberal Gun Club, that the people in the Pink Pistols back in 2005 in San Francisco were more concerned, or that they were more worried about telling people they own a gun than they were about telling people they were gay. It's kind of a fascinating dynamic there. right? But and I think this piece is just another indicator that there is meat to that there is real consequences that will likely come in the long term from more Democrats and liberals owning firearms. Even though, as we did that really good podcast a while back with the NBC pollster who showed that, your partisanship tends to have more impact on how you view guns and gun policy than gun ownership, but not totally. Democratic gun owners are more favorable or are less favorable to new restrictions than non-gun owners who are Democrats. So I don't know. I still think this opens up the idea that long-term, one of the big trends, macro trends for us to track is what effect more women, more minorities, and more Democrats buying guns has on our gun politics over time.
And like I said, it would just be interesting to see gun ownership become less party line split as it used to be.
It would be better for the gun rights movement for sure. I would think, but I don't know.
We'll see. We'll have to see.
It's still an unproven thesis in my mind because we're not seeing some massive shift in the Democratic Party on this. If anything, the Democratic Party has continued to move left from where they were. Because even though Harris has walked back support for mandatory buyback of assault weapons, one of her top campaign promises is still to ban the most popular rifle in the country, right? As part of an assault weapons ban. The AR-15 is the main target of that ban. So, and that's not something Democrats were doing when Barack Obama ran for president, right?
Right.
So I don't know that we've seen the practical effects of this really play out in our politics so far, but I've always thought it would be more within the party, probably starting at a local level. You get the slightly more gun-friendly Democrat outperforms in their primary, and that's more where you would probably see this kind of thing. We did have the NRA endorse a Democrat this cycle, only one in Alaska, but they didn't endorse any last cycle. So maybe that's something. I don't know. These are the things that we want to keep looking for because there's reason to think there will be change based on this, but we haven't really seen the empirical evidence of it quite yet.
Right. I think it'll be a slow burn, but like you said, we'll have to keep on top of it.
Yep. Well, that's all we've got for you guys this week. I am hoping that my Phillies Nats game does not get rained out here tonight. So we'll see. But clinched the 2 seed, hoping to get that 1 seed. It would be nice if the Dodgers could lose some games here. They're being annoying and coming back and winning the last couple. So Phillies really need to pour it on the Nats during this series. I don't know what happens if it gets rained out because the playoffs start next week, right? So maybe there's a couple days in there where they have built in. I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully we won't see, so I can just go to this game.
Yeah, fingers crossed for you.
All right. Well, we're going to head over to me, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Dispatch. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Olive Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news in the same way that we do here at The Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.